Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about the HOA that thinks it owns acres of my land. When I first inherited my grandfather's extensive acreage, I was simply overjoyed that I could finally put my horticultural dreams into action. I had planned on gradually expanding my orchard, adding a few livestock barns, and maybe constructing an additional barn for modern farm equipment. What I never anticipated was that a homeowners association, one that didn't even have a legitimate claim to anything on my side of the county, would suddenly decide to lay claim to my property. Let me start with how my farm is set up, because it's important to understand the scope of what we're talking about. My land stretches over 1,700 acres of rolling hills, scattered groves of trees, and carefully tended fields. At the edges, there are a few roads that connect to the nearest small town, but my actual residence is way inside the property. I like the peace and quiet, which is why I built my home close to the orchard that my grandfather planted decades ago. The orchard is in a valley near a small pond, so my house sits in a nice, secluded spot with a comforting view on three sides. Every time the sun sets, I can watch the sky light up in vivid pinks and oranges behind the orchard, which has always been one of the biggest perks of living out here. But not everything is as idyllic as it sounds. Over the past few years, there's been a push from a newly formed homeowners association in a neighborhood that sprouted on what was once farmland adjacent to mine. I'm not in that subdivision, nor is my house located anywhere near the new development. However, their group, let's call them the Candler Hills Group just for simplicity, became infamous almost overnight for hounding everyone about uniform mailboxes, correct fence heights, specific yard decorations, and whether your house color fit their palette guidelines. They were absolutely convinced that every property in the vicinity needed to fall under their domain. You can imagine how bizarre that might sound for folks living on wide-open farmland, where we typically value independence above all else. The first time I heard about them, I just rolled my eyes because I figured they couldn't possibly have any authority over me. The farmland had been in my family for generations, well before any houses were built in that area. The property lines were clearly established in the county records, and my farmland was explicitly zoned as agricultural. There was no mention of an HOA anywhere in my deed or official paperwork. Because of that, I thought I could safely ignore them. They might bug the folks living in that new development, but they certainly wouldn't cross into my domain, or so I believed. For a little while, I was correct. They mostly kept to themselves, busy handing out warnings to the brand new homeowners who had joined that subdivision under the impression that the association's fees were minimal and the restrictions were mild. I guess that's how they lured people in. The real trouble began when I noticed some brand new signs popping up along the edges of my property. These were not small yard signs. They were large, professionally printed placards that stated something about private property, HOA members only beyond this point. They were hammered directly into the ground in several spots near my east fence. At first, I thought maybe they had put them up in the wrong place. That eastern edge is somewhat near the new development, so possibly they mixed up the boundary line. So, being the polite person that I am, I took a few pictures of these new signs and emailed the association's general contact address, letting them know that they had presumably installed signs on my side of the property line. I asked them to remove the signs within a reasonable time frame because they had no jurisdiction or ownership over my land. I got no reply to that first email. Another few days went by. During that time, I did notice from a distance a couple of individuals in safety vests and carrying measuring tapes milling around on the eastern side of my acreage. They were definitely not from the county. The local county surveyors drive official trucks, wear official badges, and don't set foot on private land without permission. These people had bright orange vests but no logos, just generic store-bought gear. I decided to approach them to see who they were and what they were doing. When I walked up, they ignored me at first. Finally, one of them gave me a dismissive wave and said, "Don't worry about it, we're just verifying the association's plan." Now, if that doesn't sound ominous, I don't know what does. I repeated that I was the owner of this land and asked to see any documentation that authorized them to be there. They said they didn't have to show me anything because they were contracted by the relevant party. Now that set off warning bells in my head. They had no right to be there without permission or an official county order. Realizing that I wasn't going to get anywhere arguing with them in the field, I told them firmly that they were trespassing and needed to leave. They just waved me off, so I documented as much as I could. I took photos, wrote down approximate times, and gathered as much evidence as possible. Then I told them one last time to leave my land immediately. I walked away expecting them to pack up, but as soon as I got back to my house, I saw from a distance that they had gone right back to their measuring. That got me furious. I immediately called the county sheriff's office to file a trespass complaint. A deputy came out, took my statement, and said that next time these people showed up, I should call them right away. The deputy also said it might help to post no trespassing signs along that stretch to remove any confusion. So, the next day, I spent the entire morning putting up big, bold, private property no trespassing signs, each one about 50 yards apart. I made them extremely visible. If that wasn't enough to stop them, I wasn't sure what would. The deputy's advice was practical, and I hoped it would end there. But what do I see about 2 weeks after this incident? There are even bigger signs from the HOA hammered directly underneath my no trespassing warnings. Their signs read, "Property owned by HOA name. Violators will be prosecuted." Let me tell you, my stomach dropped when I saw that. I had expected them to remove their smaller ones or at least try to call me. Instead, they doubled down. They had plastered new markers over my signs, effectively defacing my property warnings with their nonsense. I took more pictures, got out my phone, and called the sheriff's office again. Another deputy came out, wrote a more detailed report, and told me they'd escalate the matter. The deputy also advised me to get in touch with a lawyer since this was heading toward some kind of boundary dispute. Around that time, I started getting bizarre letters in the mail. Let's talk about how the mail system here works. I don't get direct delivery out at my house, so my mailbox is located near the county road, a good half-mile from my house. Typically, I pick up my mail once a day. In that mailbox, I found official-looking letters from the Candler Hills group. At first, I thought they might be response letters to the emails I'd sent, but they turned out to be something more perplexing. The letters said I was now part of the association, that the membership fee would be $300 a month, and that failure to comply with the association's guidelines might lead to fines or further legal action. They even threatened to place a lien on my property if I didn't pay the monthly dues. I nearly laughed out loud. They had no grounds to do any of that, but it was extremely unsettling that they even thought they could. I put the letters aside to show my lawyer as soon as I found one to handle this mess. Before I could calm down from that shock, about a week later, I looked out my front window early in the morning to find 3 people I didn't recognize strolling right across my field. One was carrying a clipboard, another had a camera, and the third had a measuring wheel. They were near a grove of fruit trees, and the orchard was nowhere near the border with the new development. This was blatantly deep into my acreage. Furious, I raced out in my work boots and demanded to know what they were doing. The one with the clipboard huffed and said, "We need to inspect the property to ensure compliance with standards." Her tone was dismissive, as if I'd wasted her time by showing up. I informed her quite bluntly that they were trespassing on private property, and that if they didn't leave, I'd involve law enforcement. She shook her head and said something like, "We have every right to be here. This entire land is subject to the rules of the association. By the way, you owe us the main gate key, or you'll face further consequences." That's when I realized they were truly delusional. My main gate was a wide double gate that connected to a private drive on the southeast side. It's locked with a heavy chain and padlock, and only I and a few close friends who occasionally help out have that key. The orchard is behind that gate, plus other parts of the farmland, so obviously it's crucial for me to keep it locked. Yet here they were, demanding that I hand over access so they could come and go at will. My temper flared. I told them point blank that they had no legal footing here, no right to demand a key, and that if I saw them again, I'd involve the police. Then, as we were speaking, I literally dialed the non-emergency number for the sheriff's office. After that call, they scurried away, probably figuring it would take a while for any deputy to arrive. But this time, I got a hold of the same deputy from earlier, who had grown somewhat familiar with the situation. He arrived about 40 minutes later, took a statement again, and said he would personally speak to their association's leadership to see what was going on. However, it didn't seem like the deputy had the authority to arrest them on the spot unless I pressed charges or physically caught them in the act again and demanded it. The lines of trespassing enforcement can sometimes get complicated, but he assured me he'd try to resolve the situation. I was growing tired of playing whack-a-mole. It was always me calling the authorities, me writing new no trespassing warnings, me putting up barricades that they would promptly disregard. It was wearing me down, emotionally and financially. I eventually found a local attorney who specialized in property disputes and explained the whole fiasco to him. He was shocked by the nerve of this association. He promised to send them a cease and desist letter, along with a formal notice that they had no legal claim to my land. He also said he'd be prepared to file suit if they continued. Though I wasn't fond of the idea of going through a lengthy legal process, I agreed that if they didn't back off, a lawsuit might be inevitable. Life quieted down for about a month. During that period, I kept my eyes peeled, half expecting to wake up one morning to find random folks wandering around my fields again. I busied myself working on the orchard, overseeing some repair work on a barn, and meeting with a friend of mine who's a local veterinarian. This veterinarian friend, Adeline, was the one who normally took care of my livestock when I needed help. She had heard rumors around town that the association was bragging about acquiring new land for a community project. Folks found it suspicious because the association had no official authority to just acquire farmland in that manner. Word was spreading, though. My neighbors and I had a feeling that something was brewing behind the scenes. Then, in the middle of that relatively calm period, I noticed something startling one morning. I had gone out for a routine inspection to check fence lines and see if any wildlife had caused damage overnight. To my utter disbelief, I found brand new large signage in the middle of my biggest field. These signs weren't just hammered into the ground near the edge. They were staked right into a spot that was maybe half a mile into my land, near a path that I used for my tractor. The message read, "Coming soon, Association's private park." Beneath that was a set of rules, including park hours, 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., and a note about parking in designated areas only. I actually stopped in my tracks, rubbed my eyes, and wondered if I was dreaming. The audacity was unfathomable. I was so flabbergasted that all I could do was take pictures of everything. The signs, the angles, the footprints leading away, the tire tracks. I then promptly called my lawyer, who nearly dropped his phone when I told him what had happened. He told me in no uncertain terms that we needed to escalate this and file for an injunction or something to stop them from continuing these blatant trespassing and property rights violations. He scheduled a meeting with me to get all the evidence in order so we could move forward legally. However, things took an even more bizarre turn before we could finalize any legal moves. While checking the signs for a second time, I found a group of about 5 people discussing development plans in the field. I recognized one of them from earlier, the clipboard lady. There was also a man in a neatly pressed polo shirt who seemed to be the leader, so I walked straight up to them and demanded to know what they thought they were doing. The man told me, "We're doing an official walkthrough for the association's new recreational site. We have the right, as per our guidelines, to develop this area for community use." He talked about playgrounds, picnic areas, hiking trails, and more. I stared at him in disbelief. This was my private farmland, and they were acting like they owned 1,700 acres of it. Then, to top it all off, they demanded once again that I give them the keys so they could have faster access to the site. My mind reeled at the utter audacity. I told them in no uncertain terms that this conversation was over. I said, "You're trespassing on private land. Leave immediately or I'll call 911. The man in the polo shirt smirked as if to dare me. He said, "Go right ahead. We'll show the police our paperwork and you'll see you've been in violation of our guidelines for quite some time." That was the last straw. I was done playing nice. I took out my phone, dialed 911, and told the dispatcher that I had a group of trespassers refusing to leave my property. Given the tension that was building, I also mentioned that I was worried the confrontation might escalate. The dispatcher told me to remain calm and wait for an officer. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, 2 sheriff's patrol cars pulled up near the edge of the field. The moment the deputies stepped out, I walked over to them, explained the situation clearly, and showed them the new signage that the trespassers had put up. I told them, "They're demanding the keys to my gates. They've hammered these signs into my property, and they will not leave." The group from the association tried to talk over me, waving their own papers around. But the lead deputy, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, asked them to state their business. The man in the polo shirt claimed they had legally acquired an easement over my property, which allowed them to develop it for their neighborhood. The deputy asked to see official documents or anything from the county or a judge that confirmed this. All they had was a typed sheet of association bylaws. No county seals, no official signatures, nothing recognized by the local government. The deputy flipped through the pages, closed them, and said, "You realize this is private farmland, correct? This gentleman is the documented owner. If you have no official deed, no official court ruling, and no valid easement papers, you are trespassing. The man in the polo shirt got flustered, insisting that our lawyer said we're in the right. The deputy asked for the lawyer's contact information, which the man refused to provide. Then I told the deputies that I wanted to press trespassing charges because these people had repeatedly ignored the previous warnings. The second deputy started reading them their rights right then and there. As soon as they heard about the possibility of arrest, a couple of them looked genuinely frightened. The man in the polo shirt started insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that they would leave immediately, but it was too late. I had already told the deputies about the months of harassment, the repeated intrusions, and the signs hammered into my property. It wasn't just a matter of them stepping foot on the land. They had defaced my property, posted false ownership claims, and refused to comply when asked to leave, multiple times. The lead deputy had no sympathy. He said, "We have your statements, we have photographic evidence, and we have multiple prior reports of trespassing from this property. If your association or your personal lawyer has any legitimate claim, you'd better bring it to court. But you can't handle it this way by walking onto someone's farmland and planting your own signs." The entire group ended up being placed in handcuffs. 2 were put in one patrol car, 3 in another. They were told they would be processed for trespassing and defacing private property. I remember the man in the polo shirt demanding the deputies call a higher authority or something along those lines. The deputy told him that if he didn't calm down, he'd add resisting arrest or disturbing the peace to the charges. The man finally shut up. I was both relieved and a bit anxious. I hadn't actually expected it to end in them being physically arrested right then and there. But given the repeated incidents, I suppose the deputies had had enough of the nonsense. It was a small victory for me. I took a moment to gather myself. My heart was pounding because while I was outraged, I'm not the type of person to enjoy seeing others cuffed. But they had crossed so many lines that I felt they had it coming. The next step was to pursue them through the courts if they didn't relent. My attorney was thrilled that I finally had a strong law enforcement incident on my side. He told me this would make any lawsuit for damages and harassment much stronger. We planned to file for a restraining order against the association's leadership to keep them off my property. Additionally, he advised me to petition the county to investigate the association's other questionable activities. If they were forging paperwork or lying to new homeowners about the extent of their authority, that could be a serious legal matter for the county to address. Interestingly enough, the fallout from that arrest ended up dragging in more than just the 5 individuals. Word got around town that they'd been booked for trespassing, and some of the people living in that new development started questioning the association's claims. From what I understand, some of the homeowners there believed the farmland belonged to the community, or that they had some partial right to roam. They'd been told that was part of the draw of living in that subdivision. In reality, it was never part of the association's land. The farmland was always separate, never sold to them, never annexed, never included in any official documents. The association, or at least some of its leaders, had apparently spun a tale that the farmland was eventually going to be turned over for community amenities. So a lot of the new residents were blindsided to learn that it was all a farce. During the following weeks, I had multiple residents from that development reach out to me apologetically. They asked if I would allow them to walk or jog across my fields if they politely asked for permission. Some were genuinely kind folks who had no idea about the drama until the arrests. I explained that while I wasn't opposed to friendly neighbors, the farmland was private property, and I needed to ensure no damage came to my crops, orchard, or livestock. We talked about possible solutions, like letting them use a designated path around the perimeter if they signed a waiver, but even those conversations were just hypothetical until the dust settled. I mainly needed to see the association stand down and address their leadership's behavior. Meanwhile, I discovered more bizarre attempts by the association to rationalize their activities. Apparently, they had tried to backdate some documents that claimed the farmland was annexed decades ago, which was absolutely impossible. My lawyer and I made sure to submit all relevant documents to show that the farmland was never part of any deed transfer. We included county records, my family's historical ownership documents, and the orchard's registration as a protected agricultural site. Eventually, the association's attempts at forging or misrepresenting ownership became so obvious that the county threatened them with stiff penalties if they didn't cease immediately. They were essentially cornered. Just when I thought the situation had reached a boiling point, I received another letter in the mail from someone claiming to be a representative of the association's newly appointed leadership. This letter was drastically different in tone. It started with something akin to an apology, stating that previous leadership misunderstood certain property boundaries. They offered to remove all signage, pay any fines incurred, and requested that I drop any pending charges. They also said they would be happy to meet in person to foster a better relationship. On the surface, that might sound conciliatory, but I was wary. I had no reason to trust them after what they'd pulled. My lawyer agreed that I should not meet them alone, nor should I accept any handshake agreement. He said if they wanted to make amends, it should be done through official channels, with legal documents clearly stating they revoked any claim on my farmland. If they were sincere, they'd have no issue providing that in writing. As for the charges, it wasn't just a matter of me dropping them. The sheriff's department had become involved, and the county prosecutor might decide to press criminal charges anyway, depending on the severity of the evidence. Trespassing can sometimes be handled with a misdemeanor citation, but the repeated nature of their intrusions, plus the large-scale signage, might escalate things. Throw in any potential forgery or fraudulent claims, and it was quite the legal mess. A few days later, the entire board of that association requested a meeting with my attorney and me at the county courthouse. We agreed to talk in a supervised setting. When we arrived, there were 3 board members. The man in the polo shirt who had been arrested was not present. Apparently, he had been removed from his position. These 3 new board members apologized profusely for everything that had happened. They claimed they had been led to believe the farmland was somehow zoned for their use, that a transitional agreement had been signed years ago. They insisted they were duped by the old leadership, referencing some fictional agreement. My lawyer pulled out the official property records and land survey details, verifying beyond any doubt that I had sole ownership. One of the new board members hung her head, clearly embarrassed. The others seemed uncomfortable. They ended up agreeing to sign a statement acknowledging that my farmland was never and would never be under the HOA's oversight. They agreed to pay a hefty settlement for the repeated trespass incidents, as well as reimburse me for legal fees and the cost of removing their signs. My lawyer put everything in writing, and we had the county clerk notarize it. That meeting concluded with them practically begging me not to push for further charges. But I reminded them that the trespassing arrest had already happened. I couldn't wave a magic wand and make that go away, because the criminal aspect was up to law enforcement. They'd have to work that out with the courts. When I got home, I felt a wave of relief for the first time in months. The newly installed signs had already been removed by a contractor that they hired. They even took down the ones along the eastern border, as well as the huge private park sign near my tractor path. It was like all traces of their intrusion had vanished overnight. I walked my property lines that evening, making sure there weren't any other hidden markers or anything suspicious left behind. The fields looked peaceful, exactly as they should. The orchard was the same orchard that my grandfather had planted, free of any meddling from outside parties. Throughout the rest of that month, I kept lines of communication open with my lawyer. We followed up on the settlement they'd promised. True to their word, I eventually received payment for legal fees and damages. The county also completed its own investigation, concluding that the association had indeed posted signage on land that never belonged to them. As for the group that was arrested, they ended up with trespassing charges that likely resulted in fines or probation. I wasn't privy to all the details of their sentencing, but I know the man in the polo shirt was facing additional charges for forging paperwork. I heard rumors around town that he had tried to file fraudulent property documents to support his claims. Whatever the final outcome, law enforcement certainly didn't let him off easy. After the dust settled, a few people from the association's neighborhood reached out to me again. They were reasonable folks who explained that they had never wanted any trouble. The old leadership had sold them a dream that their neighborhood fees would go toward building a community park, some walking trails, maybe a pondside picnic area. All of that was apparently meant to attract new buyers to the subdivision. They were as shocked as I was that these board members and their hired surveyors had ventured so boldly onto farmland that wasn't theirs. I felt a bit sorry for the residents, especially because so many had been roped into paying higher dues for a project that never legally existed. In a gesture of goodwill, I arranged a small open house event on my property, not for the HOA, but for locals who wanted to see the orchard and talk about agriculture. I hosted it just outside the orchard fence in a safe and controlled area. It was my way of saying I wasn't anti-neighbor. I simply demanded that people respect the boundaries of private land. I explained how the orchard worked, showed how we cultivated different varieties of fruit, and even allowed them to sample some fresh produce. Many of them told me they admired the property and understood now that it was never supposed to be forcibly taken over by a homeowners association. We parted on a decent note, with the understanding that if anyone from the neighborhood wanted to visit, they'd have to come as an invited guest, not as self-appointed owners. One interesting side note came from Adeline, my veterinarian friend. She said that after the scandal broke, the association's leadership saw a mass exodus of board members who had either resigned or been voted out. The new group was apparently more transparent and dropped any illusions about owning farmland. They revised all the materials they gave to prospective buyers, making it clear that the neighborhood's boundaries ended well before the orchard. Whether that helps or not remains to be seen, but at least there's progress. In the aftermath, I realized a few crucial lessons. First, never take it for granted that people will respect clear property lines, especially if there's some misinformation or potential for profit involved. Second, keep thorough records of everything. From the first day I spotted suspicious signs, I took photos, noted times, and kept all letters. That documentation was invaluable. Third, stand up for your rights swiftly. The longer you wait, the bolder trespassers can become. And finally, sometimes it really does take calling 911 for the authorities to see how serious a situation is. I also reflected on how my grandfather would have handled things. He was an old-school, no-nonsense farmer. He probably would have escorted them off the land with a stern warning, and that might have been that. Times have changed, though, and the sense of entitlement can run high. Perhaps it's a sign of the modern world that an association like that would try to annex property without so much as a legitimate deed or anything resembling a legal agreement. The important part is that justice was served in the end. To this day, I still keep my gates locked, my no trespassing signs posted, and my phone ready to document anything suspicious. But ever since that final confrontation, the property has been free of unauthorized visitors. I occasionally see a neighbor jog along the main county road, but they always wave from a distance, never crossing the fence line. The orchard remains a peaceful haven for me, my animals, and my close friends and family who come by to lend a helping hand. I guess the biggest takeaway from all of this is that people will sometimes go to outrageous lengths if they believe they can get away with it. The association had convinced themselves that they could treat my 1,700-acre farmland like their personal extension. They posted signage, threatened fines, demanded keys, and even brought in surveyors. Yet in the end, facts and the law were on my side. The repeated warnings, the thorough documentation, and finally the bold step of calling 911 led to their downfall. Watching them get placed in handcuffs on my field was surreal, but it drove home the point that trespassing on private property is no minor matter, especially when done so blatantly. Friends, thank you. See you soon.